delighted to have Professor Emmett here directing the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty, giving it new life, all kinds of programs. So this is the third speaker event that the center has had in the 2018-2019 year. Apparently funds were low, so Ross is speaking for the second time. 2 of the 3 events. Actually, no. Of course, you had to walk by the gauntlet of information outside, so please pick up the schedule of events for the center and also for the school. Economic Thought and Leadership, our terrific series this year on the theme of polarization and civil disagreement, and then other lecture events that we have. And of course, the students in the room should know that we have a major, a BA degree, we have a minor. Spread the word. Among the great things that Ross is bringing to our school is that as a faculty member in the school, Professor of Political Economy, he is helping Professor Peter McNamara to continue to build our course offerings in political economy. So this semester he's teaching a course on entrepreneurialism and innovation. Next semester, I think his course is on Adam Smith and classical political economy. So this was something of an impromptu lecture idea. That's why Ross is speaking twice within 6 weeks or so for the center, because of a speaker who came to Arizona State University, and I'll leave Professor Emmett to tell you about that. So this is in some ways Ross Emmett's response to that. And as you can see from the handout, he's been preparing a book review of the book by some speaker who came to ASU a few weeks ago. Just a brief introduction of Ross. We lured him here from Michigan State University, from the interdisciplinary James Madison College at Michigan State. He was already teaching in an interdisciplinary environment as a professor of political economy, and already used to hanging out with political theory and constitutional law types of people. He is a scholar most well known of the Chicago School of Economic Thought, particularly Frank Knight, but also has written on Keynes and on Adam Smith and on Malthus and on religion and economics, or religion and political economy. So we're delighted to have him here talking about Democracy in Chains, ? James M. Buchanan, Political Economy and Democracy.
Thank you very much. I am here to talk about Jim Buchanan. And Jim Buchanan is someone who not many non-economists know about. Perhaps if you're in political science, you may know about him. And even within the economics profession, when he won the Nobel in 1986, the Nobel, one has to distinguish because the Nobel Prize in Economics, which will be awarded, I believe, a week from today, or a week from yesterday, in Stockholm, well, it will be announced in Stockholm. It's awarded in memory of Alfred Nobel, not a Nobel Prize. So we sometimes call it the Memorial Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, because it was added after Nobel's own creation of the Nobel Prizes back a long, long time ago. This is the week where you hear the Nobels announced, of course, so it's a fun week. So I decided to talk about some about Jim Buchanan's work, introduce you to Jim Buchanan's work, specifically how his work relates to discussions about democracy. And of course, this has been spurred by about a 2-year discussion and argument about Jim Buchanan's work that has been going on because of the publication of a book which does not have a question mark after the words Democracy in Chains by Nancy MacLean, which specifically identifies Jim Buchanan as kind of the architect of a plan for the radical right to steal American democracy, and focuses upon its connection to the Charles Koch and the Charles Koch Foundation. And as a disclaimer, I have received funds for programming with students from the Charles Koch Foundation. And you feel free to ask me about anything about those things. But my presentation is going to be on Jim Buchanan. As I said, Buchanan won the Nobel Prize in 1986. and the official designation of his award says that it was for the development of the contractual and constitutional bases for the theory of economic and political decision-making. I have to say that people were surprised when Buchanan won the Nobel, and there are many accounts of sort of inside baseball in the Nobel committee for him winning. But in the longer picture of things, despite the reluctance of some economists at the time to consider Buchanan's work significant enough for a Nobel, he lived for almost another 20 years past the awarding of the Nobel, and in his work, in the continuation of that work, certainly made him among the most prominent of economists in the discipline, and widely respected in the discipline, as I will point out near the end of my talk. What I thought I could best do and best use as an organizing device for thinking about Buchanan's work is to describe his work as starting from a relatively narrow basis, at least the public's perception of his work is starting from a fairly narrow basis in public choice theory, and then engaging a larger and larger, or a sort of more expansive set of questions as his career develops to the end of his life in 2000. Whenever it was, whatever the previous slide said, and 13, yeah, and it was in the 2010s, so I want to say a few words about this and identify this. This is also reflective of themes that other people are speaking about with Jim Buchanan. Richard Wagner at George Mason University, who was Buchanan's student and then Buchanan's colleague and co-author, and now has written a book about Buchanan that quite accidentally came out at the same time as MacLean's book. And I'm friends with Dick Wagner, and so we did a meeting together at George Mason talking about the importance of Buchanan's work. And one of the themes of Dick Wagner's work is that Dick says, I was constantly pushing Jim to find more open-ended ways of talking about the ideas about democracy and about public choice and the work that he was doing. And Jim would always come back to Dick and say, I'm speaking to the economics profession. And the economics profession has a language. And that language is narrow. So I stick with what will speak to the economics profession, not to others, but to the economics profession. And then, so you'll see as I progress through this that if you know anything about economics, you can see the sort of emerging widening of language that would reach the economics discipline as a way of helping them to see how a constitutional public or choice-oriented conceptualization of our activity, both in the economic and political worlds, might be framed. But just to quickly begin this, Jim did his PhD at the University of Chicago, and he focused upon the topic of public choice. At the time, public choice was a discipline which was largely dominated by institutional economists who wanted to talk about sort of how roads were financed, and very standard public choice kind of discussions and arguments. His thesis supervisor was a professor at the University of Chicago who was a public finance scholar, Roy Blau, and Blau was nearing retirement and wasn't really that interested in supervising a dissertation. And often, for example, weeks would go by and would never show up to his office. So Jim would wait for a meeting, and there never would be a meeting. So eventually he sort of stopped interacting with Blau and turned to a professor whose work he had encountered and whose own he had him as a professor, in his graduate in the coursework for his graduate program at the University of Chicago, and that was Frank Knight. Frank Knight, at this point in the late 1940s, when Jim was at the University of Chicago, was almost about to retire. Knight retired in 1952 from the University of Chicago, and so Knight was nearing retirement, but he was still active and engaged, as he continued to be throughout the rest of his life. And he had taught Jim in a History of Economic Thought course, which was required of all students at the University of Chicago in their first year. It was the third quarter of the first year sort of price theory sequence. So you did you did price theory, and then you did money and incomes, and then you did History of Economic Thought as the sort of first year of Chicago graduate work. And for the other two courses that that Buchanan took during his first year at the University of Chicago, he had Milton Friedman as his professor. Friedman had just arrived back at the University of Chicago after having been a student there himself, and Friedman was sort of in his prime. He was a force of nature, but actually Buchanan didn't really like him. Okay? And he was more attracted to the Midwestern style of Frank Knight, the constant questioning of everything, the constant pushing just in class, just kind of going off in different directions, whatever came to him to think about and talk about and engage the students with. And students complained because he didn't have a syllabus and he didn't teach you what he said he was going to teach you. So people would take his classes 2 and 3 times, and by the third time they would go, oh my God, this changes the world. He was a difficult professor to study with. But the career that I want to speak about begins about 10 years later, when Buchanan begins to write and with his colleague, Gordon Tullock. And by this point in time, after a couple maneuvers, a couple places that he had gone, he was at the University of Virginia, and he and Tullock had founded the Thomas Jefferson Center for the Study of Political Economy. The Thomas Jefferson Center at the University of Virginia seems appropriate, and the Center for the Study of Political Economy. By the way, the first guest speaker, the first person who gave a set of guest lectures for that center was Frank Knight. And the book that came out of that lecture series is called Intelligence and Democratic Action. And it's a book that I've written about some, and we'll write about more. And actually a year ago, this weekend, I ran a conference, Liberty Fund conference, for a group of scholars on that book. It was the first time Liberty Fund had sponsored a conference on Frank Knight's book, Intelligence and Democratic Action. So at Virginia, Buchanan and Tullock launch a program called the Theory of Public Choice. And this theory of public choice uses standard economic assumptions, as I'm going to point out in a minute, to analyze not market decisions, but decisions in the public sphere. But here I mean not just legislative decisions, but also bureaucratic decisions and other decisions that are made in public. And I'll explain a little bit more about what public choice logic is, but that was big. And here, notice, as I suggested at the beginning, Buchanan doesn't try to stretch the boundaries of economics. He takes a very straightforward economic analysis and uses the standard assumptions of economics at the time as his foundation for the examination of these choices. In fact, in his earlier work, he had actually said more about a sort of open-ended kind of perspective. But for the purposes of starting this research program, the narrow focus of economic analysis of public decision-making is rooted in public choice. But then about 10 years later, you begin to see him, as the conversation and work continues, beginning to make arguments about how democratic decision-making and public choices need rules about how they're going to be made, right? And so he began to ask questions about the next level up, not just public decision making in a legislature or in a bureaucracy, but about the rules about how the legislature was going to be made, right? And those rules are defined in constitutions, whether they're written or unwritten. Okay? There are countries with unwritten constitutions. I won't identify them for you, but I know them. Hope you do too. In all countries, there are rules about how we make rules. And so Buchanan became interested in constitutional economics, a program that occupied, one might argue that it occupied the rest of his career, but it certainly occupies the next 20 to 25 years of his career. And here we get a kind of interesting discussion of a two-stage decision-making process. A decision-making process about our constitutional rules, and then our decision-making process under those rules about decisions that we're going to make in the public sphere. Okay? And he becomes interested in both of these stages, and he particularly becomes interested in how constitutionally formed rules that happen in the constitutional space, may assist or constrain, okay, democratic action. And then as the economics profession changed, and as his own discussion and thinking changed, by the way, the constitutional economics program is really launched at Virginia Tech. I grew up in Virginia when it was VPI, so I still tend to refer to it as VPI, but it now goes as VaTech. So at Virginia Tech, that was when the constitutional economic program really was launched and began and spread. Public choice was still going strong too. And then he moved to George Mason University, where he was when he won the Nobel, and so the constitutional program continued at George Mason. And then towards the end of his life, the last maybe 20 years of his life, you found him asking questions about the entire democratic process, both constitutional and legislative, and asking questions about other institutions that play a role in shaping our political and economic life. One of those would be social norms. So how do social norms affect? He became very interested and concerned about questions like the work ethic. If a society has a certain kinds of set of legal rules that are based upon a constitutional framework which sort of assumed a certain kind of work ethic, if that work ethic changed, would that society's constitution continue to work as well? He also, throughout much of this time, was concerned about what the journal Constitutional Economics once had an issue on, the status of the status quo. Right? Sort of, do you worry about the status quo? Okay? In making decisions, does the person who owns property have some kind of privileged status against the other person in the exchange, or so how do we conceptualize people who have assets that they were acquired or were given to them or are natural to them, that they have under one constitutional framework? What happens as rules change? And there's a very good, if you're interested in this topic, there's a very good video, although the quality is poor, much poorer than what this one will be, of a dialogue between Jim Buchanan and Warren Samuels, who was another of my mentors at Michigan State University. And the two of them are talking about constitutional economics and Jim's career work. And they have a long and very interesting conversation about the status quo. And many of the George Mason people, and myself included, think that Warren won the debate, that Warren had better points than Jim did about the status quo issue. So it's an interesting dialogue to watch two people who have equally great knowledge about law and economics and constitutional economics and economic theory and philosophy to enter into a dialogue about the status of the status quo. So I want to mention briefly two economists who shape Buchanan's work. As a graduate student, Buchanan encountered in the depths of the University of Chicago library, which you no longer have access to because they now have it all electronically provided, a book in German on public finance written by Wicksell, the Swedish economist of fame. Wicksell was well known, but this book on public finance was not well known. Buchanan found a German copy of it, learned enough German to translate it, portions of it, and began his examination of public finance, in part inspired by Wicksell. I'll say another word about that later. The Nobel lecture that Buchanan does only mentions Wicksell as an important part of shaping his work. And that's because Wicksell is fundamentally important to both the public choice and the constitutional economic part of Buchanan's work. But the other person that Buchanan had a picture of on his wall was Frank Knight, the University of Chicago professor that was his first mentor and maintained a friendship and mentorship throughout his life. And it's interesting that Knight is not mentioned in the Nobel lecture because Buchanan often mentioned him in biographical statements. But the Nobel was given to Buchanan for public choice in constitutional economics and not other things. And Knight, on the other hand, affected Buchanan not only at the beginning in the appreciation for how markets worked, but also this open-ended conceptualization of what democracy is. And he used frequently and introduced to Buchanan frequently the expression that democracy is government by discussion, not by voting. It's not majoritarian. It's the search for how we as a people are going to live through conversation. Just again about Wicksell and Knight, I've mentioned from Knight the notion of democracy as government by discussion. From Wicksell, a different principle, but one which influenced Buchanan frequently, was the unanimity principle. Now, most democratic theorists will out of hand reject any notion of unanimity as an ideal. Wicksell liked to think about unanimity as ideal. He does not argue that we should only agree to things that we unanimously agree upon, okay? But he used it as an ideal. And that principle guided Wicksell's conceptualization of a constitutional framework. So one of the things that comes out of this unanimity principle that's often misunderstood, because one of the arguments is, how would we all agree upon what the speed limit ought to be? Like we can't require unanimity on everything. So we shouldn't have it for anything. And Wicksell and Buchanan argue that at the constitutional level, there needs to be a higher level of agreement on the things that are fundamental to the way that we are going to live than necessarily agreements on speed limits or budgets or things like that. So Wicksell and Buchanan argue for a higher degree of majority rule, closer to unanimity, than at the constitutional level than at the sort of post-constitutional level. But I also wanted to point out that both scholars argue in favor of universal suffrage. Okay? And this is really important to recent discussions about Buchanan because in a number of places Buchanan has been criticized for being willing to support policies which, in a sense, do not allow people to participate and especially do not allow people to vote. In fact, he was asked in Chile to write a defense of a rule that the Pinochet regime wanted to create that would use a sort of mathematical way of saying we're going to have a small group of people represent everyone. And Buchanan turned around and in front of several of these people gave a lecture in which he vociferously defends universal suffrage and representative democracy at the large scale. So the Chile example is an example of where Buchanan actually works against the interests of those who thought what he might have said. He says something very different and supports. And of course, this all emerges out of this theme. Right? Democracy is government by discussion. Right? It can't be government by discussion if it's just a small elite who is making a decision. I'm going to skip over this and move forward. So remember I said that public choice theory was based upon standard economic assumptions. Well, here are the standard economic assumptions that in the Nobel lecture Buchanan mentions specifically as the basis for public choice. Methodological individualism, the notion that ultimately economists explain decisions on the basis of individual action, values, and judgments. So economists don't, and to this day, economists still maintain methodological individualism. Methodological individualism does not allow an economist to say that as a member of a group, people do this. It's ultimately always rooted in the decisions and actions of individuals. Secondly, economic rationality. Now here's the one that a lot of people buck against, especially against the notion of economic rationality that the economists in the middle of the 20th century tended to adopt, and that is one that says people do what's in their best interest using economic logic. Okay? And some textbooks in economics make the mistake of saying economics assumes that all people are selfish, and which is not the argument that they need to make. The argument that they should be making is that individual rationality says we all have purposes, and we efficiently seek to satisfy those purposes. Okay? And those purposes may be for yourself, and frequently they are. And they may be for other people. Indeed, and so in the sort of the logic of public choice theory says, it doesn't really matter who you are, all of us have both of these kinds of interests. We have a public interest and we have a private interest. So a bureaucrat, let's say somebody who's in the EPA, wants to improve the environment. But they also want a better job. So they're going to try to do things that will enable them to get a better job. Maybe they're actually not interested in environmental policy, but that was where they got in, and they really want to move over to some other aspect of government service. They're going to do things where they are to enable them to go do something else. So they have a public interest, but they also have a private interest. They have their own interest, which they will pursue. And even those who are normal citizens, they want to do what is their interest, but we often act on the interest of others. I do things for my mother. I do things for a colleague. And those kinds of conversations and that kind of logic is at the core of economic rationality. The third one, politics as exchange, is the other part of public choice that really concerned people. You're describing our political life as being just like the market. Yes, Buchanan does that. And the second book down here, 1968, the title of that book is The Demand and Supply of Public Goods. You mean I can draw demand and supply curves? I thought public goods just should always be provided. Well, how many? What's an over-provision of public goods? Is there such a thing? And what does it cost to provide public goods? How do you factor in the cost of providing public goods? So Buchanan examines that using standard supply and demand analysis. Okay? And public choice, of course, had an edge to it in that way that often led to strife with political theorists and political scientists. Constitutional analysis and constitutional economics comes out of that framework by raising the question to, well, what are the constitutional contexts within which these political and bureaucratic decisions are being made? So are there constitutional constraints on certain kinds of action? Are there constitutional elements which enable the kind of problems that public choice theory sometimes identified? For example, the notion that there's no, essentially, there's an internal dynamic to many legislative processes which perpetually escalates the size of the budget. Because if you need to do more, you just pass a bill saying we need to tax people more. Do more, tax people more. Do more, tax people more. Okay? So that logic said, oh, are there constitutional means of doing this? You can see that Buchanan's work over this spans several decades. And it emerges out of this notion that if you and I are contracting with each other to form a polity, to form our own government or self-government, we would not agree to give unrestricted authority to people if we didn't know what our position in that society is. Those of you who are political theorists will recognize a strong similarity here to Rawls, the Rawlsian veil of ignorance. Well, Rawls was a founding member of the Society for Public Choice, and and he and Buchanan had long discussions about this notion of a constitutional moment and the notion that it would require us not to know, how do I participate in writing a constitution if I know what position I'm going to occupy in that society? Aren't I going to write the rules to benefit my interest? How do we protect ourselves against that? And they and others continued that discussion for a long time. By the way, Buchanan introduced Rawls to a mentor of his, Frank Knight, and I believe that Rawls got the notion of the veil of ignorance and the context of the veil of ignorance from Frank Knight's essay, The Ethics of Competition, in which he defines what requirements are necessary for perfect competition to exist. And they map very closely and interestingly onto the constraints of the veil of ignorance in Rawlsian theory. And sorry, that's in-house baseball for those of you who are not political theorists, but for those of you who are, it's sort of interesting connections between other branches of American discussion about liberal democracy and Buchanan and Knight. And by the way, notice he's very careful here. All three branches of government are equally included. Doesn't matter. We wouldn't give authority to a parliament, right, legislative branch, to a judicial tribunal, or to a military junta, legislative, judicial, executive. Okay. And the basic logic, I've expressed it, but just to portray it visually, is a two-stage process. In stage one, the constitutional moment, we make the rules about how we make the rules. Hayek called this law, if you're Hayekian. And then there's the legislative process of making rules. Okay? And that's legislation. Now, in Buchanan's case, as he began to think about this kind of two-stage logic, he became interested in specifically two, and I've kind of mentioned them already, but two ideas as constitutional changes that might be significant for democratic societies. One is some kind of balanced budget amendment. And notice Buchanan moved to George Mason University in the early 80s, right around the time that Ronald Reagan was elected president. He won the Nobel in '86. And that's during Reagan's term. And one of the things on the agenda was the notion of creating a balanced budget amendment to the US Constitution. Buchanan eventually realized that you could still get around balanced budget amendments, right? You want to spend more money? Pass the budget, raise the debt ceiling. Pass the budget, raise the debt ceiling. Increase taxes. You can't stop the logic. So he begins to turn to other kinds of questions, but he was the major academic voice on balanced budget amendments. And then the supermajoritarian argument. The argument that, for example, a 2/3 majority or a 60% majority would be needed for certain kinds of legislation because it would express to a greater extent the agreement of a larger portion of the population than just the sort of common majoritarian democratic argument which says 51% and then we can do anything we want to the other 49% in the population. That was, of course, Buchanan's concern. Limit the authority of a majority in Congress or in Parliament to deal poorly with the other half of the population. If you get a larger percentage of the population agreeing to things, then it's more democratic, was Buchanan's argument. It's actually closer to the democratic ideal because the democratic ideal is about consensus building through democracy by discussion. So that takes us then to a couple last comments. I thought I'd add this in from Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen won the Nobel Prize in Economics 1998. And his work and Buchanan's intersect and cross over each other at many, many points throughout their lives. They both have an interest in social choice and public choice. They both have an interest in constitutional issues. They both in many ways reconceptualize their logic of economic thinking over time. And they actually met at many points as well, but near the end of Buchanan's life and Elinor Ostrom's life, at George Mason, they held a conference with Sen, Ostrom, and Buchanan to talk about the connections between their work. And this comment comes before that, but Sen was a willing and interesting participant in this. So notice the last line. Sen says, "I disagree with them." Okay? And they did. They disagree with each other quite significantly. But notice what he says. Buchanan's impressive. In my judgment, he has done more than most to introduce ethics, legal political thinking, and social thinking into economics. Okay. I just conclude, by the way, these two books are two of the last books he published, and the notions of increasing returns and of ethics is present in both of them. But I just thought I'd close with the final line of the lecture, The Constitution of Economic Policy, which is his Nobel address. And before that last line, he calls this last line the continuing question of social order, which is how can we live together in peace, prosperity, and harmony, retaining our liberties as autonomous individuals who can and must create our own values. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to questions. I'll just say we decided to print up this sheet connected to Nancy MacLean's book, Democracy in Chains. There have been several, actually a large number of people compiling various mistakes in the book. There are 5 categories of mistakes, ranging down to simple things like in a quotation, using the wrong page number or the wrong year of publication, so minor things. This comprises the top list, that is claims that are actually central to her thesis of the book, okay? And fundamental mistakes in those historical claims made about Buchanan and also to a certain extent the Charles Koch Foundation. So I have included the link so you can go and find more on that if that's your interest. As I said before, I'm not here to bash on Nancy's book, but to give us a description. Well, Scott, go ahead.
Okay, so I've been worried about this, as you know, for over 1.5 years now, since the book came out, and I followed all of the commentary. I think I've read everything, but I think I've read a fair portion of everything that's come through. I know all of these people who have done the analyses, right? And I mean, for all of the problems that have been pointed out, what I have a problem with in the book is something that I don't think anybody else has really pointed out, which is her implicit vision of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
That's why I focused on Buchanan's
right.
vision
So I mean,
of
I want to ask, well,
democracy.
what do you really take to be her implicit vision of democracy in the book? Because I mean, the whole notion, the whole title of the book, right, Democracy in Chains. You would think that the implication is that unchained democracy is a possibility, which of course it's not. Unchained democracy, if you really think about what it means, everybody votes on everything, is a red herring. That doesn't exist anywhere, right? So once we understand that that doesn't exist, then we're in the game of what are the rules. We're in the game of how do we chain democracy, right? We've got to chain it somehow because unchained democracy is not a real thing. So right. So I mean, what do you take?
I'm not going to say a lot about it, but I'll say two things. One, majoritarian democracy. It seems fairly obvious that that there's an assumption that majority rule wins is a sufficient description of democracy to not have to say anything else. Okay? But there's also a notion, and so this is what's the other part of this, is there's a notion that there's some spirit to democracy that's captured by progressive social movements. And so there's this sort of interesting tension between an appeal to majoritarian democracy, which you've very adequately criticized, and some kind of notion of forward progress to a more accepting, more liberal view population that's driving it. And these two things, we might argue, are at odds with each other, but they're not uncommon, right, to discussion about liberal democracy today. And indeed, liberal democracy has always had an idea that the world would be better if we could make it more democratic, but making it more democratic also involves creating a context. So, if you use the Knight argument, democracy is governed by discussion, he was very concerned to want to improve discussion. Right? So that was how you do it. I'm not sure where Nancy MacLean would stand on that, but so I'm just presenting it simple. There's the problem of democracy and sort of majoritarian argument. Okay, so I think she accepts that. But then there's some notion that through social movements and other things, we can push the spirit of the democratic people forward. And she sees Buchanan, that's what she's really concerned about, because she sees Buchanan in public choice theory focused only on individuals and maintaining that economic logic of individual choice, not group choice, and then of the super majorities. Ironically, super majorities are a chain on democracy because it requires too much agreement, I guess. I'm not clear about that.
My point is just simply that the most appalling error in the book is that she doesn't seem to recognize that game that she wants to play is exactly the game that Buchanan is playing as well.
Completely. Yeah. I thought you were going to ask a question. No. Were you going to ask a question? No. Oh, I just thought you were going to, and then you put your hands on top. You do what I did, you put your hands on top.
As I was raising my hand, you pointed to him.
Yeah, exactly.
Good done.
Somebody over here? Yeah, Tom.
So some of the critics of MacLean have said that she actually seems to be on the same side as maybe someone like Robert Bork, if you take this defense of majoritarianism seriously. That some of the groundbreaking Supreme Court decisions that most people on the progressive side would champion were actually efforts by an elite, this strange elite institution to thwart the will of democracy, thwart the will of
I
majority.
don't know enough about that argument to comment. So I'll let the comment stands. I can't say one thing or another about it. So I tend not to be. I haven't spent a lot of time on Chicago law, and and so I'm weaker on that than I am on the econ and public choice kind of side. Scott, Steve,
Yeah, sorry. Okay.
Steve.
I do have a question about the experience in Chile, because it does
Yeah.
seem as if, not just by McLean, but others too, like lump folks like Friedman and Buchanan all kind of in the same camp, saying, oh, well, just the fact that they went down to Chile at all in the first place to even talk to people who were involved in it, this sort of brush of
Right.
guilt. What differences would Buchanan have with other free marketers who might have dealt with the Pinochet regime on different reforms? And is there something fundamentally different in their thinking that caused them to come to different conclusions?
Right. Yes. And two comments. There's an article forthcoming in the Southern Economic Journal on Buchanan in Chile, written by a group of historians that have spent now about a year and a half going through all the documents and all the evidence. Buchanan went twice to Chile. In McLean's book, she says he went numerous times, and she also says that he advised the Chilean president Pinochet on the construction of a new constitution. He only went twice. He never spoke to Pinochet. He never spoke to the top advisors. He was invited by a couple of people relatively high, and he spoke to a student group, and he spoke to the Admiralty, so the leaders of the Navy. And in both talks, he spoke strongly about the themes I identified about democracy and suffrage, which are themes that run really counter to the Pinochet regime's progress. But I think the person we would want to use as the biggest contrast would be Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman argued at a number of places and in his own work during the 70s and 80s exhibited this. He said monetary theory is monetary theory. It's equally relevant to any regime, any country in the world. And so I'm willing to give advice to any country in the world that's willing to entertain sound monetary policy. Right? And so in a number of countries, Friedman advised regimes, democratic, authoritarian, in between, on monetary theory in the hope that a solid monetary theory would constrain other aspects of their activity as well. And so Friedman presents a nice contrast to Buchanan. Notice I never said that Friedman was an advocate of authoritarianism. He was not, but he believed that his theories, he believed that he was an expert and had expert knowledge that was relevant to any regime. And Buchanan has a very different message. His message is, my expertise tells you not to trust experts, but to trust democracy as discussion. So ultimately, he was one of the early challengers to what we call the tyranny of expertise. And the people who have developed that argument are people who were his students or friends. And so the notion of the tyranny of expertise, especially in democratic societies, but elsewhere as well, is an interesting one. And because he says fundamentally it's discussion of people that matter, not the rule of experts. And Frank Knight has a very similar view, and it comes out interestingly in his exchange with Hayek on a totally obtuse subject, capital theory. The economists in the room will all go, capital theory, my God. So Frank Knight and Hayek writing letters back and forth in the early 1930s on their capital theory dispute. They had two different conceptions of capital. They were arguing back and forth. They had published articles. They were writing back and forth. And in 1933, early 1934, Hayek acknowledged that Knight had a point and that he would need to reshape his argument to reflect Knight's argument. And so in the correspondence between them, notice in the discussion between the two of them, Knight felt that he and Hayek were coming closer to some kind of agreement. And then, lo and behold, he receives in the mail a new journal, and the new issue of a journal. I believe it's the Economic Journal. And it had a lead article by Hayek called The Mythology of Capital. It's one of Hayek's most famous essays, right, in capital theory. Yeah, and in The Mythology of Capital. And at the bottom of the first page is a footnote that says, this paper is written in the spirit that a formal published version of one's strongest argument is the most appropriate way to enter into academic debate. And then he basically says, the subsequent part of the footnote, I've talked about this with Frank Knight, but he's wrong. Okay? And the entire article, of course, is an attack on Frank Knight's view. And on the view that Frank Knight held prior to their conversation, and with no acknowledgement that Hayek himself was willing to rethink some of his viewpoint. Knight wrote to him immediately upon receiving the journal and said, if this is the way the advocates of freedom work together, they might as well send us to the mines today. This is 1934. Okay. Frank Knight declined a PhD from the University of Heidelberg in 1930 and told the university that I thank you very much for wanting to honor me. However, I will not enter Germany, right, at this time because of the regime. Right?
So in addition to
Yeah.
academics
Yeah.
engaging in conversation, you mentioned the improvement of the public conversation or civic conversation. What's behind this vision, and how do either Knight or Buchanan envision this? And in the spirit of Skettle, what would a public choice theory civic education look like?
You don't want a small task, do you?
No.
So it's an. You're putting me on the spot. No, it's good, Trevor. I just. So the modeling conversation, not giving expert knowledge. And I think Skettle already does that with engaging texts that are significant texts, but not saying that the person who's in the room who is an expert on the text is therefore the person who has the right to speak, but that this is a text that everyone has an opportunity to engage and to think about. Or to do that maybe not only with text, but also with problems. Right? Or engage people in teams to solve problems together. Right? Like, it's an interesting endeavor. For about 5 years, a colleague and I at Michigan State, when I was at Michigan State before I came here, we got together a group of about 10 students, and we gave them a single question. What's the one thing you would do to make Michigan more entrepreneurial and innovative? And go. And we told them, this is not a class. You're like a research team. So divvy yourselves up, divvy responsibilities. Somebody's got to organize the money. Somebody's got to organize public events. Somebody's got to organize our meetings. It's no longer a class. We have meetings. And we said, our job at the beginning of this course is to bring in some people or take you to people who think about this problem and let them talk with you, and you can pester them with questions. So we actually did no lecturing in the course whatsoever, and we did not lead any discussions in the course. We either took students out into the world and had them encounter people who were interested in these questions. We went to Grand Rapids, we went to Detroit, we went into Lansing, we met with legislators, we met with business people, we met with entrepreneurs, we met with venture capitalists. And then at some point, the students said to us, and this happened every single year, they said to the two of us, you're wasting our time because you're an academic and you like to talk, and we have work to do. So get out of our room, and we'll call you when we want you back. And then they went to work and put together proposals, and they spoke to the board of the university, and they did an event. They decided to start a nonprofit which would bring together entrepreneurial firms with students willing to work in entrepreneurial firms, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the only problem was they were all seniors, and of course they disappeared to fantastic jobs right afterwards. And so everything fell apart. Every year it was recreating, but it was a simple project. Here's a question, you figure out an answer, we'll provide resources, we'll help you, but we're not the masters. We're not the experts. In fact, there were times they stood up and said, this is what we ought to do, and I'm just going like, ooh, this is not what I would be doing, you know? But it wasn't my job. It wasn't, I didn't evaluate them on their ability to mimic me. I evaluated them on their ability to do something. And they were just awesome. It was amazing to see what they would do. Does that give you some ideas?
Out into the world didn't fall apart, but rather.
Oh yeah, no, they still are amazing people, even though some of them I cringe about what they're doing. But you know, such is life. That happens.
This maybe goes back to my first question, Russ. I'll put something that you said, but with a much more harder edge. That
Sure.
The public choice, approach that Buchanan inaugurated, can be seen as breeding a sort of deep skepticism of
Yeah.
the government. These guys, legislators, bureaucrats, they're no different from us, and maybe they're worse than us because they got more
There may be
power.
incentives that in the public sector that give them access to. It wouldn't have necessarily said that they are more selfish, but that it's their incentives. The incentives are there. Yeah.
So there's an interesting parallel because if you date it sort of 1960, in another segment of American society or Western society, there's a sort of parallel skepticism of government. And this side thinks that the radical right has already taken over America, and then you get the Students for a Democratic Society and all those kind of movements. So there's this parallel, sort of two roads coming out of the same moment in some ways, I think. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, whether there's any parallels between the
Students for a Democratic Society and the radical
public
right, or
choice.
the opposite of the radical
public,
right,
the public choice.
the public choice.
Yeah. This sort of skepticism of established institutions.
Well, I mean, it certainly is possible, although Buchanan wrote a book about the SDS,
Oh, we did, yeah.
called Democracy in Deficit? No, what's the book? It's the,
It's called,
that's Wagner.
it's escaping me. No, I mean, it's the one he wrote right after he left UCLA.
Right, so,
It's about free college education or whatever it's about.
yeah. So look up the book, okay? Written in 63, 64. He wrote it after, he left the University of Virginia in protest over the university's refusal to give tenure to Gordon Tullock. And so he just said, fine, I'm gonna resign. And they were like, good, bye. And he was like, oh. So he went to UCLA, I think for 2 years, but it might have only been one, and encountered UCLA and the progressive student movements, And this was the year Berkeley, offices were held, or maybe it was UCLA office students held the president's office, and he was very disillusioned. And it's interesting because I said in a book review that I wrote, Scott, for the research annual, I think I say this. I say, his book actually sounds like Nancy MacLean's book in the opposite direction. So that book, in many ways, sounds like what she's saying about the radical right, he says about, and it's like MacLean's book, it's published by a popular press, not a academic press, that book. There it is. I knew it was. Yeah, he loves this alliteration. He loves these alliterations. So it's Academia in Anarchy, and it really reads like. I mean, as I thought about it, I was like, there's a lot of parallels between these two books in exactly the way you're describing. Like his. So go read it, and I was like, where do I see Buchanan, the careful writer and theorist? Out the window. The world's falling apart. The place in the universe that has the potential to hold together, the university, is falling apart. Paul.
Build on Trevor's question about kind of public choice civic education. I had not seen a quotation by Amartya Sen that you offered, which is very interesting, to praise Buchanan, but it echoes Sen's own work as appreciating the achievements of the previous century or so of economics as a discipline, but suggesting that it wasn't academically sound to so sharply distinguish this new social scientific mode of economic analysis from questions of ethics and political theory. So I assume that would be a part of a public choice, this conception of public choice civic education. But I want to follow that comment with a question. I presume that in the book, Democracy and Change, Nancy MacLean really does not explore these dimensions of Buchanan's intellectual development as you did.
Right.
Or as Amartya Sen would say, would be necessary to even understand his ultimate conception of public choice economics, and then to assess what its stance was toward this theory of democracy or that theory of the ethics of democracy. So, right, she doesn't account for these.
So I
dimensions of
can. This gives me the opportunity to say a word about the other major problem in her work. The Chile one for me is a big one, because she really over exaggerates the claims that are made, and the claims that are made are not well founded in the first place. And so it comes off as a really bad historical mistake. The other one that's really a bad historical mistake stems from a simple mistake, and I can imagine any historian making it, which is to trust the source and not go back and look at the original. And so in commenting, in asking questions about Buchanan's engagement in this voucher article that was a voucher essay that he and Warren Nutter wrote, and that was then reported upon in a Richmond newspaper, because in Virginia there was a huge amount of discussion about segregation and desegregation after Brown versus Board of Education, and there was an effort to use vouchers, and many people realized that the voucher introduction, this proposal to introduce vouchers, was really an attempt to allow segregation to continue. And then Buchanan creates an article that's a report that's about vouchers. It's actually very different than Friedman's vouchers, which are the traditional vouchers. If you know about vouchers, that's the traditional model you think of. And so there's a kind of automatic assumption that this is all a support of segregation, and then it's reinforced very dramatically by the claim that there's a link because of where this report was written about in a newspaper, there's a very strong link between Buchanan and Kirkpatrick's massive resistance movement in Virginia against desegregation. And Kirkpatrick was the journalist who led the charge on trying to keep Virginia with segregated schools. And Kirkpatrick was the editor of a newspaper. It's on here. Kilpatrick, sorry. Kilpatrick. I never can remember which it is, but and that. So Kilpatrick was the editor of the Richmond News Leader. Okay, and she says that the report about Buchanan's essay was published in the Richmond News Leader, and then uses that to link to Kilpatrick, and hence the massive resistance movement. But in fact, it wasn't published in the Richmond News Leader. It was published in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, which had an editor who I would describe as mildly desegregationist. Not rapidly, radically desegregationist, but leaned towards desegregation. And he reported on the article because he thought it was an interesting article about how a voucher system that Buchanan and Nutter wrote about, that this kind of voucher system could support desegregation. That would be interesting. And the person who was her source had used the correct newspapers in his doctoral dissertation. And then in the essay he wrote using his doctoral dissertation for a book on social movements, he switched the two newspapers. I'm assuming this is just an error. I mean, Richmond Times-Dispatch, Richmond's News Leader, I get them confused. So, then this fellow spoke with Nancy McLean, gave her a copy of his article. It has the wrong newspaper. She draws the conclusion from it that there's a connection to Kilpatrick, and creates a whole argument about Buchanan and the segregationist Virginia. And Buchanan's entirely on the other side. And I don't mean that he is, someone who was massively in support of complete desegregation of the South. That's not my argument. It's just that he wasn't on the other side, and that's of interest. It connects to some other things, which I won't go to. Thanks. Go ahead.
Join me in thanking Professor Allen.